Did you know that several soldiers at the Battle of Thermopylae, including 2 Spartans, had to be dismissed because of their combat stress? These men were named Tremblers, and at least 1 Spartan hung himself rather than return home in shame. Welcome. Today, let's break open PTSD, specifically the wild ride our ancestors must have had dealing with it, the futuristic treatments we now use, and finally, how we evolved our understanding of this tangled and complicated subject. Post-traumatic stress disorder, or PTSD, has now become the modern diagnosis attributed to this manifestation of certain mental health conditions after traumatic incidents. Okay, so if PTSD is our new term, then surely mental trauma isn't a new concept. Recalling the human history of PTSD is to invoke what must have been fascinating displays of individual perseverance and human resolve. So let's start there. The amateur historian in all of us needs only to imagine how many countless millions must have been left with devastating mental disorders from humanity's many, many gruesome historical events. How, if at all, did our contemporaries view, label, or treat these conditions? As it turns out, we don't have to look very hard. Artifacts, tablets, and literature that begin dating as early as 3200 BC are flush with mental anguish, beginning in one of the oldest surviving pieces of notable literature, the Epic of Gilgamesh, where we find the main character has become tormented after witnessing the death of his closest friend, and the epic clearly details how this brought on horrific daydreams and recurrent nightmares. Assyrian tablets from this period also detail the torment of soldiers who were expected to be active on campaigns that lasted several years. These would involve the brutal hand-to-hand combat that dominated their time. Records originating from this period explain how ghosts were to blame for causing certain soldiers to enter altered mental states after battle. The men are described as being of a wandering mind and having ghost-induced nightmares with the loss of cognitive function, despite no obvious physical injuries. Spiritual doctors would go on to use drugs, incantations, and rituals to treat these earlier maladies. Famed Greek historian Herodotus also describes how some Athenian soldiers later suffered hallucinations and spontaneous blindness following their close encounters during the Battle of Marathon in 490 BC. Then there was Rome. With the benefit of their enduring empire, they were acutely aware of these stress reactions. These caused their legionnaires to be, quote, struck dumb with terror, and they noted that severe cases would cause men to self-injure in the hopes of avoiding further combat, perhaps one of the first recorded instances of this behavior. These examples of mental trauma can be found littered throughout early history, and it's not hard to imagine why. For thousands of years, we have followed a visceral and very personal practice of lining up shoulder to shoulder across from our enemies. Then on the sound of a trumpet, a drum, or a pitched call, we would begin cutting into each other in the most animalistic ways we are capable of as a species. Our reward for surviving each of these close encounters was yet another person dying horribly underneath us, and my imagination runs wild with the sound, the fear, and the adrenaline that must have washed over these men and women before, during, and after such experiences. The Iliad and the Odyssey, both hugely influential epic poems from ancient Greece, are wrought with grief, using words such as wrath and rage to describe Achilles during his campaigns. Even the poem of Hercules, who we idolize to this day, has his roots in pain and suffering. It's often glossed over how his journey to undertake the 12 labors begins only after Hera murders his wife and 3 children, driving him to suffer visions and madness, which at the time was assumed to have been sent from the gods. Shakespeare gives us a brief glimpse of medieval PTSD-like symptoms in his play Henry IV. In the play, the wife of a war veteran describes her husband's behavior after having returned from war. This involved a lack of sleep with outbursts of unprovoked rage, frequent nightmares, and a seeming inability to experience joy. She would portray how he, along with his fellow soldiers, would be beset by great terrors in the night, and despite having returned home, would choose to sleep in their armor alongside their weapons for months on end. These nights likely turned to prayer and holy men for consolation, hoping to absolve themselves of their sins and thus any guilt they carried.
We men are wretched things.
Like Shakespeare, these disorders became known by many prominent historical writers, perhaps giving us further confirmation of just how widely trauma and tragedy was experienced and fictionalized. Our modern take on these tales are just as popular today at the box office, and perhaps in embracing these early forms of discussion on the subject, we progressed our knowledge of PTSD, an inch towards an understanding that it is not only relegated to combatants or frontline workers. Unfortunately, our attempts to treat this mental trauma remained rudimentary and unproductive for most of history. Demons, the devil, and wickedness were too often named the culprit. Faith in a higher power and spiritual reflection might be the only solution offered for this punishment God has beset upon you. The medical community was also slow to accept this hidden mental trauma. The spectrum ran from acknowledgement of a condition all the way to, that's a paddlin'. Luckily, in the 17th century, the Swiss took a break from burning heretics and began identifying specific behaviors that match our current diagnosis today, and they called this condition nostalgia. They wrote how they could tell true nostalgics from those soldiers who were faking mental injury in the hopes of being removed from combat. Genuine nostalgics would often quickly retreat into themselves, suffer from melancholy and a loss of appetite. They would become quick to enrage, and suicide among them would become commonplace. And once more, our old friends from the battlefield would return to haunt our dreams, not unlike the Syrian soldiers from generations prior. A visit from your Swiss doctor of choice would entail cures that include leeches, of course leeches, purging the stomach, and warm hypnotic emulsions. Yum. Soldiers would be often treated with much less patience. Beside the frustrations of maintaining a fighting force, there were few, if any, successful treatments available. As an Austrian physician of the time once reported, their efforts could do little to help these men out of their stupor. This slow pace would become the standard toward our modern understanding of PTSD. We would call it different names and often rebrand it as we struggled to make sense of it. Nostalgia would make one of its last appearances in the Civil War, where it would be attributed to weakness, cowardice, and a feeble will. Yet, far from the battlefield and any calls for honor, it was discovered that the very same symptoms of anxiety, guilt, and sleeplessness would also strike survivors of railway accidents. This diagnosis would instead be labeled as railway brain in an attempt to attribute it to unforeseen physical damage. And yes, while head trauma can be an actual explanation for some of our earlier ancient examples, I can't help but also wonder how many people suffered due to a poor diagnosis. In World War I, shell shock became the hot new term, and this name derived from the horrific shelling troops endured leading to the condition. In response to a flood of affected troops, the method of forward psychiatry was devised as a frontline treatment, and this would rely on three principles. The idea was to keep soldiers orientated within the theater of war in hopes that they could then be returned to the fight. Several of our modern treatments continue to share some of these principles, but this is debated, and shade has been thrown at this practice, accusing it of being more used out of a need to maintain the fighting force than a genuine desire to help those afflicted. Medical authorities also made an interesting discovery when they noted the exact symptoms of anxiety, tremors, and nightmares were manifesting in support troops who had been nowhere near the front lines. This drew yet one more conclusion, hinting that PTSD might expand beyond the business of warfare. During World War II, shell shock was replaced by combat stress reaction, and maybe only here the true damaging effects to both man and war machine were now becoming evident. Military records show that up to half of all military discharges during the war may have been related to this combat exhaustion. That is a ton of lost manpower. Ongoing care and follow-up also began for those who had severe or chronic symptoms, and those being treated for longer periods sometimes underwent radical treatments like hydrotherapy, electrotherapy, and even hypnosis in Europe. Now, our true understanding of modern PTSD began in the 1950s when the American Psychiatric Association, or APA, added gross stress reaction to its repertoire. A psychological issue stemming from a traumatic event, combat or otherwise, was now diagnosable and open for study. Well, we screwed that up. Our belief was that mental issues were short-lived, and any symptoms lasting longer than 6 months was thought to have had nothing to do with any previous combat or trauma. The diagnosis and any support it gave would have to be removed and replaced. Luckily for patients, and unluckily for most everyone else, the Vietnam War happened, and in a brighter, more modern medical light, we could finally accept the links between the trauma of war and post-military civilian life. Thanks, Lieutenant Dan. Currently, PTSD is no longer considered an anxiety disorder and is now in its own category of trauma and stress-related disorders with its own set of 4 symptoms. Here they are now. Most of us will experience at least a few of these in our lives, and so for you to be diagnosed, all 4 symptoms must be present and last at least 1 month with significant distress and interference with day-to-day functioning. PTSD is still hard to treat today, and the answer to how we should treat these stricken people going forward is still hotly debated. In a nutshell, state-of-the-art treatments include different cognitive or exposure therapies. These are forms of psychotherapy and involve a gradual process to help a person take incremental steps toward a behavioral change. They might practice re-establishing social circles or slowly begin to reimagine their traumatic incident with some assistance. This is often with a trained psychiatrist, but nowadays it can be done using virtual reality. This allows a scalable experience to match the patient's needs and comfort level. Drugs, like those we use to treat anxiety, also play their part, and more innovative therapies include injections to block the fight or flight nerve bundles that may trigger PTSD in the first place. In a big way, veterans are turning to cannabis, magic mushrooms, and ecstasy to treat their symptoms. Scientists who study these psychedelics are lobbying for reduced drug laws after witnessing their positive effects in those with severe trauma. Our vets could definitely use the help too. Iraq and Afghanistan once more showed us that you don't have to be involved in direct combat to experience damaging mental effects. Criminally late to the party, PTSD has also finally been recognized in our frontline workers. This opened care to every aspect of public service providers, from emergency services to Ben, who takes your shit all day at the DMV. It comes as no surprise now, but up to 30% of Canadian police have been living within the diagnostic criteria of PTSD, whether they know it or not. Firefighting is also fraught with traumatic exposure. After all, we ask these humans to enter a burning building to find or recover bodies exposed to ungodly heat and flames. To make a long story short, medical professionals, emergency dispatchers, and every other person we rely on can now display their own studies showcasing just how wide the effects of burnout and PTSD are in the present day. And with today's information, we can paint a grim picture of our past. And it's incredible with our modern understanding to think of just how many people we must have left behind to suffer. We can tell ourselves that we were ignorant of the science, oblivious to the afflicted, or simply just not in a position to help. But if we were to continue to fail these men and women who take care of us, then we are not only damning them yet again to suffer their nightmares alone, but also ourselves when we call on them to help us in our darkest hour. Check out our other videos detailing our drug use throughout history and how we've learned to cope up to this point.